Hello everyone and welcome back to our video series on the topic of the nervous system. So why does this topic matter? Well, if you're sitting there and you're able to hear me and respond to me, that's because your nervous system is working properly. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at matter, in particular white matter and gray matter, which is found in your central nervous system. And we're going to look at the structure of the spinal cord in greater detail as well. Alright, so let's get going. Well, as you've already learned, the spinal cord is part of your central nervous system, and it's incredibly important, and that's why it is also protected very well. Now, the spinal cord is found within the spinal column or your backbone, so you can see how important it is that we need to protect it with bone surrounding it. As we zoom in on the spinal cord, we will see a structure that looks something like this, and we're going to be looking more deeply into this for the rest of this video. Now, if you took a brain or spinal cord and you cut it as a cross-section, you will see parts that look white and parts that look gray. So naturally, people named one the gray matter and the other one the white matter. The reason why gray matter is gray is because it's made up mainly of cell bodies. And the reason why white matter is white is because it's made out mostly of nerve fibers. So if you take a closer look, here's the brain and here's the spinal cord. How is the gray matter and white matter arranged in the brain and spinal cord? Now, hopefully you can see that in the brain, the gray matter is on the outside, so all the cell bodies are there. And the white matter is on the inside, where all the nerve fibers from the cell bodies will extend down into the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is the opposite arrangement. The white matter, where all the nerve fibers are on the outside, while the gray matter is on the inside, in the center part. There's also a central canal, which contains a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, which is a fluid which nourishes your central nervous system and allows it to survive. Now, in this diagram here, we can see that the spinal cord extends from the brain all the way to your bottom. And it's a bit like a central highway, right? It's here, right here in the middle, and there are branches that branch out from the spinal cord. These branches are the spinal nerves, and the spinal nerves supply nerve fibers to different parts of the body. So the top part here, these nerves would supply the arms, these nerves would supply your middle of your body, your trunk, these nerves would supply your legs. Now, interestingly, if we take a closer look at these spinal nerves, so if we zoomed in at the spinal nerve, just before it reaches the spinal cord, we'll notice something interesting. So this here is the spinal nerve over here. This is the spinal nerve. Now, before joining the spinal cord, each nerve will divide into two roots, right? It will divide into the ventral root and the dorsal root. So take a look at the diagram. This is the spinal nerve, right? Each nerve, before it joins the spinal cord, will divide into a dorsal root and a ventral root. Right, and we're going to take a look at how we're going to differentiate. Now, if you actually observe closely, you can already see some difference between the dorsal root and the ventral root. In particular, you might see this bulge here in the dorsal root. And so let's take a closer look at why that's the case. So before we do that, what does dorsal and ventral mean anyway? Right, so the dorsal side is just a term that we use to describe your back. Right, so this is the dorsal side. The ventral side is your front. So if you imagine the spinal cord coming down this way, and I imagine there's a spinal nerve coming in from my arms this way. Before the spinal nerve connects to the spinal cord, it will divide the two roots, right? So it will divide into these two roots. Right, here will be the dorsal root, this one, and then here's the ventral root, because this is on the ventral side. Alright, so let's take a closer look at the spinal cord and the dorsal root and the ventral root. This is nothing new. Alright, here what we see is a receptor, right? So like your skin. And here you can see the sensory neuron that carries information from a receptor to the central nervous system, right, to the spinal cord. Within the central nervous system, we see the relay neuron, and then you can see here a motor neuron that carries information, nerve impulses, to the effector, like a muscle of some sort. Okay, so let's take a closer look now at the dorsal root. What do you notice is inside the dorsal root? So you should notice that inside the dorsal root, what we find are sensory neurons, right? Here, so here are the sensory neurons transmitting impulses from the receptor to the spinal cord. And you can see that the cell bodies of the sensory neurons, here's the cell body of a sensory neuron, are all found inside the dorsal root ganglion. So this bulge here, this bulge is called the dorsal root ganglion, and it contains cell bodies of sensory neurons. And the dorsal root, which is over here, the dorsal root contains the nerve fibers, right, the axons of the sensory neurons, which are going to the central nervous system. So what happens next? Well, the sensory neuron has transmitted impulses from the receptor to the spinal cord, in particular to the gray matter of the spinal cord, right? So this is the gray matter. And inside the gray matter, the sensory neuron synapses onto this relay neuron. And the relay neuron then carries and transmits nerve impulses to a motor neuron. So there's another synapse here where the relay neuron passes information to the motor neuron. Now this is a very direct connection, right? So from the sensory to the relay to the motor. And we will see later that this is involved in reflex actions, right? In another video, in the next video. So what happens next? Well, the motor neuron here would transmit nerve impulses to the effector, right, to the muscles. And you will notice that the nerve fibers of the motor neuron, where do they pass through? They pass through the ventral root. So the ventral root contains the nerve fibers of your motor neurons, in particular the axons of your motor neurons. Now the other thing to notice is that here's the ventral root, here's the dorsal root. You'll notice that the ventral root and the dorsal roots would join together to form the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve itself contains both parts of the sensory neurons and parts of the motor neurons. So this spinal nerve, we call it a mixed nerve, right? Because it contains both sensory and motor neurons. Now at this point, we can explore some interesting questions. What happens if we damage different parts of the spinal nerve? So if I cut off this part, if I damage the dorsal root, but leave the ventral root intact, then the person would have difficulties sensing, right? But he could still move. And if I cut off the ventral root, but leave the dorsal root intact, well, what would you expect? The person would be able to sense, but not respond or produce muscle actions. And the worst case would be if I damaged the spinal nerve or the mixed nerve. In this case, both sensory and motor functions would be affected. Alright, so that's the spinal cord, as well as the structures that surround it, right? The ventral root, dorsal root, and the spinal nerve. However, you might have realized that we haven't really looked at one part of the diagram. And that is the brain, right? The brain sitting up here. And we haven't really looked at the neurons which connect the brain to the spinal cord. In particular, you might have realized there's one neuron here which carries information from the spinal cord to the brain. And there's another neuron here carrying information from the brain to the spinal cord. So what is the function of these connections? Well, one of the functions of that connection is sensation and voluntary action. So for example, think about why you get a sense of pain and cold. You touch something with your hand, but you realize in your mind that you are feeling pain or cold. So that seems to be a connection there, right? The information is going from your arm to your spinal cord, and then something is telling your brain that you are experiencing cold or pain. And then think about voluntary actions, like when you decide to raise up your hand in class to answer a question. Yay. Well, that starts not from your spinal cord, but probably somewhere in your brain where you make the decision to raise up your hand and try, right? And then the brain would send a signal to your spinal cord, which will then send a signal to your arm to raise up your arm muscles and to answer the question. Right, so that connection between the spinal cord and the brain is also very extremely important. And there are neurons that do that. So here are the relay neurons, right, to and from the brain, as we saw in the previous diagram. And you will notice that there are relay neurons which transmit impulses from sensory neurons to the brain up the spinal cord. Right, so here's the sensory neuron carrying information, for example, about pain or cold, and it's going to your spinal cord. And then from your spinal cord, there's a relay neuron which brings that information up to your brain, and in a sense that informs your brain that you're experiencing pain. Right, so the brain interprets the impulses and you get a sensation. It's very interesting actually that your brain interprets, it's just electrical impulses, nerve impulses like blips, right? But your brain somehow interprets it to give you that feeling of ouch, or that's cold, right? And there are also relay neurons that transmit impulses from your brain. So here's this neuron in the brain transmitting impulse down to this motor neuron in your spinal cord. And then this motor neuron will then transmit impulses to muscles or something. So this is important for voluntary action, right? Because from your brain you make the decision, impulses down to your spinal cord, to the motor neuron, to your muscles to carry out the action. Alright, so here is the summary of that diagram. And it's something that we need to be very familiar with. Often we're asked to label it in the exams as well. And it will help us as we move on to talk about reflex actions. We're going to come back to this diagram again in the next video. Alright, but before we end, I would like to leave you with something interesting to find out more about on your own. And that's the brain. Right, we've talked about the spinal cord, but we've not said much about the brain, but the brain is really extremely interesting. Scientists divide the brain into the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And within these regions, there are other major regions of your brain. So for example, in the forebrain, you see something familiar, right? The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We've seen some of their functions in homeostasis. There's also the cerebrum, which is really the main part, which is enlarged in humans. And the cerebral cortex, which is where a lot of the higher functions of human beings take place. Decision making, analysis, interpretation of visual and audio information. And then there's the midbrain. And in the hindbrain, you might have heard of the cerebellum, which is actually very important in our balance and coordination. And then here you can see the spinal cord proceeding out of the brain. So if you're interested, I highly encourage you to read the textbook or to go and watch some videos on it. The brain is really fascinating. So as an example of how fascinating the brain is, here is a part of the cerebral cortex called the sensory cortex. And also another part behind the sensory cortex is the motor cortex. And it's very interesting. There's this guy who opened up people's brains and basically zapped different parts of the sensory cortex and realized that they produce sensations in different parts of the body. So when he zapped certain parts, so he zapped this part, zap, the guy felt something in his knee. When he zapped this part, he felt something in his hand. Zapped this part, felt something on his lips. And for the motor cortex, when he zapped this part, it's like the guy moved his leg. When he zapped this part, the guy moved his hand. Zapped this part, the guy moved his mouth. So very interesting. And he even came up with a way of representing. So you can see that interestingly in the sensory part, what do you notice? That actually there's a lot of area of the brain dedicated to the hand and the lips, which are very sensitive parts. And he even came out with this little figure to show proportionally, if you show the amount of parts of the surface area of the brain dedicated to different parts of our body, this is how we will look like, right? We actually dedicate a lot of our brain to the sensitivity of our fingers, right? So that's just some interesting things for you to think about. I'm very happy you don't look like this. It'd be so weird. But I'll see you in the next video. We'll talk a bit more about reflex actions. Alright, so see you there.